The bustling streets of New York City hold stories within stories, but for Thomas Walker, the real struggle was far from the noise outside his window. As a prominent advertising executive, Thomas thought he knew the challenges life could bring, until tragedy struck, leaving him alone to care for his young daughter, Emma. Every morning, he grappled with memories of his beloved wife, Victoria, and the new weight of fatherhood, determined to keep her essence alive for their little girl. However, upon returning to work at his prestigious agency, Thomas couldn't have imagined the arrival of Natalie Vega, a brilliant and ambitious new creative director. With her charm and charisma, Natalie quickly ignited something in Thomas, a spark he hadn't felt since Victoria's passing. But this connection wouldn't be without complications. Emma, sensitive and wise beyond her years, soon noticed her father's bond with Natalie, awakening fears of losing her mother's memory. Would this connection between Thomas and Natalie bring new happiness, or would it create a distance between him and Emma, leading him to confront the delicate balance between honoring the past and embracing the future? Before we dive into this story of love, loss, and family, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories filled with unexpected twists and emotional resolutions, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of the stories we share here. New York City was buzzing with its usual morning hustle, but for Thomas Walker, the world seemed to have stopped. Sitting in the kitchen of his apartment, he held a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, his gaze lost in the empty space Victoria used to occupy. 3 months had passed since cancer had taken her. 3 months of a daily struggle to keep his composure in front of his daughter Emma. The 8-year-old girl, with her big brown eyes and light brown skin, was the spitting image of her mother, a constant reminder of what they had lost. "Dad," Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "I'm ready for school." Thomas blinked, coming back to reality. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go." The drive to school was silent. Thomas glanced at his daughter, noticing how she hugged her backpack against her chest like a shield. As they arrived, Emma hesitated before getting out of the car. "Dad," she said softly, "do you think Mom is watching us from heaven?" The question hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. "I'm sure she is, Emma. Your mom will always be with us, even if we can't see her." Emma nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I miss her so much." "I do too, sweetheart." "I do too." After dropping Emma off, Thomas headed to work at a major advertising agency. As he entered the office, his assistant intercepted him. "Mr. Walker, the new creative director wants to see you in her office immediately." Thomas frowned. He didn't know they had hired someone new. As he entered the office, he found himself face to face with a woman who took his breath away. Tall, with fair skin and perfectly styled blonde hair. The woman smiled at him confidently. "Thomas Walker, I presume. I'm Natalie Vega, the new creative director." Thomas shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip. "Pleased to meet you, Ms. Vega." "Please, call me Natalie," she said, her smile becoming warmer. "I've heard a lot about you, Thomas. Your work is impressive." For the first time in months, Thomas felt a spark of something that wasn't pain or sadness. "Thank you, Natalie. I hope we can work well together." "I'm sure we will," Natalie replied, her eyes shining with an intensity Thomas couldn't decipher. "In fact, I have a new project that I think will be perfect for you." As Natalie began to talk about the project, Thomas found himself captivated not only by her ideas but by her presence. She was charismatic, intelligent, and seemed to understand exactly what he needed professionally. At the end of the day, Thomas found himself smiling as he drove back home. For the first time since Victoria's death, he felt that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. However, upon arriving home and seeing Emma sitting silently on the couch, hugging a photo of Victoria, guilt overwhelmed him. How could he even think about smiling when his daughter was still suffering so much? "Hello, sweetheart," he said softly, sitting next to her. "How was your day?" Emma shrugged, her eyes fixed on the photo. "Normal, I guess." Thomas put an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "You know what? How about we cook Mum's favorite recipe together tonight?" Emma's eyes lit up slightly. "The chicken pot pie?" "Exactly," Thomas smiled. And while we cook, we can tell stories about Mom. How does that sound?" Emma nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I like that idea, Dad." As father and daughter headed to the kitchen, Thomas promised himself that, no matter what happened, Emma would always be his priority. He didn't know that this promise would be put to the test sooner than he imagined, nor that Natalie's appearance in his life would mark the beginning of a series of events that would change their lives forever. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Gradually, a routine was established in Thomas and Emma's life. Mornings began with hurried breakfasts and car rides filled with conversations about school and work. In the afternoons, father and daughter strived to keep Victoria's memory alive, cooking her favorite recipes or looking through photo albums together. At work, Thomas found himself increasingly immersed in challenging projects under Natalie's direction. The new creative director had brought fresh energy to the agency, and Thomas often found himself staying late, fascinated by the innovative ideas that emerged in their meetings. One evening, as they worked on an important presentation, Natalie paused and looked at Thomas curiously. "Thomas," she said softly, "you've done amazing work these past few weeks, but I can't help but notice that sometimes you seem distant. Is everything okay?" Thomas looked up from his computer, surprised by the question. For a moment, he considered giving an evasive answer, but something in Natalie's gaze made him feel safe. "The truth is no," he admitted with a sigh. "I lost my wife a few months ago, Victoria. She was everything to me and our daughter, Emma. Some days are harder than others." Natalie moved closer, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. I can't imagine how difficult it must be for you and your daughter." For the first time since Victoria's death, Thomas felt that someone truly understood his pain. The words flowed, and before he knew it, he was telling Natalie about Victoria, about how they met in college, about her battle with cancer, and about the challenges of raising Emma alone. Natalie listened attentively, offering words of comfort and understanding. When Thomas finished speaking, he realized that the sun had set and hours had passed. "Oh God," he said, looking at his watch. "I should have picked up Emma an hour ago. She must be worried." "Go," Natalie said with an understanding smile. "I'll finish up here. Your family comes first." Thomas thanked her and rushed out of the office. As he drove to the babysitter's house, he couldn't help but think about Natalie and how good it had felt to talk to her. When he arrived, he found Emma asleep on the couch. The babysitter, an older lady named Mrs. Johnson, looked at him with concern. "Mr. Walker," she said quietly, "the little one was very restless. She asked about you several times." Guilt overwhelmed Thomas as he picked Emma up in his arms. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Johnson. It won't happen again." Back at home, he tucked Emma into her bed. The little girl woke up briefly. "Dad," she mumbled sleepily. "Where were you?" "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Thomas said, stroking her hair. "Work ran longer than expected. But I promise it won't happen again." Emma nodded and fell back asleep. Thomas stayed watching her for a moment, noticing how much she looked like Victoria. Guilt washed over him again, this time mixed with a feeling of confusion. Why had he felt so comfortable talking to Natalie? Was he betraying Victoria's memory by feeling this way? The following days, Thomas tried to spend more time with Emma. They went to the park, watched movies together, and even tried to make a pie following Victoria's recipe, with disastrous but laughter-filled results. However, at work, Thomas couldn't help but feel drawn to Natalie's presence. She always seemed to know what to say to encourage him, and her enthusiasm for work was contagious. One afternoon, as they were reviewing a project, Natalie looked at Thomas with a smile. "You know, you should bring Emma to the office someday," she suggested. "I'd love to meet her." Thomas was surprised by the suggestion, but the idea appealed to him. That would be great. Emma would love to see where her dad works. "Perfect," Natalie said, her smile widening. "How about you bring her on Friday? We could all go out for a meal after work." Thomas agreed, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. On one hand, he was eager for Emma to meet Natalie. On the other, a small voice in his head asked if he wasn't moving too fast. That night, as he tucked Emma in, he told her about the plan for Friday. "I'm going to your work?" Emma asked, her eyes shining with excitement. "Yes, sweetheart," Thomas replied. "And you're going to meet my boss, Natalie. She's really looking forward to meeting you." Emma's smile faltered for a moment. "Is she your friend?" Thomas hesitated before answering. "Yes, I guess you could say she's my friend. She's a very kind person." Emma nodded slowly, but Thomas noticed that something had changed in her expression. Before he could ask, Emma turned over in bed. "Good night, Dad," she said quietly. "Good night, sweetheart," Thomas replied, kissing her forehead. As he closed Emma's bedroom door, Thomas couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Was he doing the right thing by introducing Natalie into their lives? How would Emma really react to meeting her? With these thoughts swirling in his head, Thomas went to bed, not knowing that Friday would mark the beginning of a drastic change in their lives. Friday arrived faster than Thomas had anticipated. The morning passed in a whirlwind of activity, preparing breakfast, making sure Emma had everything she needed for the afternoon at the office, and trying to calm his own nerves. Emma was unusually quiet during the drive to school. Thomas looked at her in the rearview mirror, noticing how she fidgeted with the edge of her new dress, a gift he had bought especially for the occasion. "Are you excited about coming to the office today, Emma?" Thomas asked, trying to break the silence. Emma nodded without looking up. "Yes, Dad." Thomas frowned, concerned about his daughter's lack of enthusiasm. "Is something wrong, sweetheart? You know you can tell me anything." For a moment, it seemed like Emma was going to say something, but then she shook her head. "It's nothing, Dad. I'm just a little nervous." Thomas wanted to probe further, but they had already arrived at school. He said goodbye to Emma with a kiss and the promise to pick her up early. The day at the office flew by. Thomas found himself constantly checking the clock, torn between anticipation and anxiety. When it was time to pick up Emma, Natalie appeared at his office door. "Ready for the big meeting?" she asked with a radiant smile. Thomas nodded, returning her smile. "Yes, although I admit I'm a bit nervous." "Don't worry," said Natalie, gently touching his arm. "Everything will be fine. I'm sure Emma is a lovely girl." Natalie's gesture sent a wave of warmth through Thomas, momentarily calming his nerves. However, as he drove to Emma's school, the unease returned. Emma was waiting at the school entrance. Her backpack clutched to her chest. When she saw her father, she ran to the car. "Hello, sweetheart," Thomas greeted, as Emma buckled her seatbelt. "Ready to see where Dad works?" Emma nodded, but Thomas noticed that her eyes were slightly red, as if she had been crying. "Emma, did something happen at school?" he asked with concern. "No," Emma quickly replied. "I'm fine, Dad." Thomas wanted to press further, but decided to let it go for now. The rest of the trip passed in uncomfortable silence. Upon arriving at the office, Thomas took Emma's hand and guided her through the busy lobby. The little girl's eyes widened in awe as she saw the colorful posters and huge screens decorating the walls. "Wow!" Emma exclaimed, momentarily forgetting her nervousness. "Do you make all this, Dad?" Thomas smiled, relieved to see his daughter animated. "Well, I help. But there are a lot of talented people who work here." When they reached Thomas's office floor, Natalie was waiting for them. She wore an elegant white suit that contrasted with her perfectly styled blonde hair. Her smile widened when she saw Emma. "You must be Emma," Natalie exclaimed, crouching down to be at the girl's eye level. "Your dad has told me so much about you. I'm Natalie. It's a pleasure to meet you." Emma, suddenly shy, partially hid behind Thomas. "Hello," she murmured. Thomas placed a comforting hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Emma, this is Natalie, my boss I told you about." Natalie, without losing her smile, continued. "You know what? Your dad told me you love to draw. How about I show you some of the drawings we're working on?" Emma's eyes lit up slightly at the mention of drawings, and she nodded cautiously. Natalie gave them a tour of the office, showing them the latest projects and introducing Emma to some of the designers. Gradually, Emma began to relax, even asking a few questions about the drawings and advertisements. However, Thomas couldn't help but notice how Emma tensed up every time Natalie got too close or casually touched Thomas. At one point, when Natalie placed her hand on Thomas's arm as they laughed at a joke, Emma frowned and squeezed her father's hand tightly. After the tour, Natalie suggested going to dinner at a nearby restaurant. Emma looked at her father with an expression that clearly said she'd prefer to go home. But Thomas, eager for his daughter and Natalie to get to know each other better, accepted the invitation. At the restaurant, Natalie did her best to include Emma in the conversation, asking her about school and her hobbies. Emma responded politely, but with monosyllables, her gaze alternating between her plate of food and her father. "Tell me, Emma," Natalie said at one point, "what do you like to do with your dad at home?" Emma looked up, her eyes shining for the first time that evening. "We like to cook together. We make Mum's recipes." An awkward silence fell over the table. Thomas saw Natalie's smile falter for a second before recovering. "Oh, that sounds wonderful," Natalie said, her voice slightly tense. "It must be very special for you both." Emma nodded, looking at her father with a mixture of sadness and something Thomas couldn't decipher. Was it reproach? The rest of the dinner passed in a tense atmosphere when they finally said goodbye to Natalie and got in the car to go home. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. It hadn't gone as well as he had hoped. "What did you think of Natalie?" he asked cautiously as he drove. Emma shrugged, looking out the window. "She's pretty," she said finally. Thomas waited, but Emma didn't add anything else. The silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded with unexpressed emotions. When they got home, Emma ran straight to her room. Thomas followed her, worried. "Emma, are you okay?" he asked, standing in the doorway. Emma was sitting on her bed, hugging a photo of Victoria. She looked up at her father, her eyes filled with tears. "Dad," she said in a trembling voice, "don't you love Mom anymore?" The question hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. He quickly approached the bed, wrapping Emma in a hug. "Of course I do, sweetheart," he said, his own voice breaking. "I'll always love your Mom. Nothing will change that," Emma sobbed against his chest. "Then why do you spend so much time with Natalie? Why do you smile when you're with her?" Thomas realized at that moment how much he had underestimated his daughter's feelings. While he had been dealing with his own pain and confusion, Emma had been watching, interpreting, fearing. "Oh, Emma," he sighed, stroking her hair, "Natalie is just a friend and my boss. No one could ever replace your mom, never. I promise." Emma nodded, but Thomas could feel that she wasn't completely convinced. As he cradled her, promising her that everything would be all right, he couldn't help but wonder if he was really handling things the right way. That night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep, Thomas sat in the living room, looking at an old photo of Victoria. What would she think of all this? Was he doing the right thing by letting Natalie into their lives? With these questions spinning in his mind, Thomas fell asleep on the couch, not knowing that things were about to get even more complicated. The weeks following Thomas's decision not to attend the conference in Chicago brought an apparent calm. Thomas, aware of Emma's reaction, made a conscious effort to spend more time with her. Weekends were filled with trips to the park, visits to the zoo, and movie marathons at home. Gradually, Emma's smile began to reappear more frequently. At work, Thomas maintained a cordial but professional relationship with Natalie. She seemed to understand the situation without needing many explanations, giving him the space he needed. However, Thomas couldn't deny the spark of excitement he felt every time they worked together on a project. One Friday afternoon, as Thomas was gathering his things to go home, Natalie appeared at his office door. "Thomas," she said with a warm smile, "the team is planning a dinner to celebrate the success of our latest campaign. I was wondering if you'd like to come." Thomas hesitated. "I don't know, Natalie. I'd have to find a babysitter for Emma and—" "I understand," Natalie gently interrupted. "But you've worked so hard on this project. You deserve to celebrate a little." After a moment of reflection, Thomas nodded. "You're right. I'll see if Mrs. Johnson can watch Emma." The dinner turned out to be more enjoyable than Thomas had expected. Surrounded by his colleagues, he found himself laughing and enjoying himself in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. Natalie, seated next to him, kept the conversation flowing with her usual charisma. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed, Thomas found himself sharing anecdotes about Victoria and Emma. Natalie listened attentively, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of compassion and something else Thomas couldn't identify. When dinner ended, Natalie offered to share a taxi with Thomas since they lived in the same direction. During the ride, the silence between them was charged with unresolved tension. "Thank you for convincing me to come," Thomas finally said. "I really needed this." Natalie smiled, gently placing her hand on his. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." Thomas: "Dice, I want you to know that I'm here for you, not just as your boss, but as a friend." Thomas looked at their joined hands, feeling a mixture of warmth and guilt. Before he could respond, the taxi stopped in front of his building. "Thank you, Natalie," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Good night." As he entered his apartment, Thomas found Mrs. Johnson dozing on the couch. He gently woke her and thanked her for watching Emma. "Dad, the little one was restless," Mrs. Johnson murmured as she gathered her things. "She asked for you several times." Guilt hit Thomas hard. He headed to Emma's room and found her awake, clutching her favorite teddy bear. "Hello, sweetheart," he said softly. "Why aren't you asleep?" Emma looked at him with accusing eyes. "You said you'd be home early." Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, stroking his daughter's hair. "I know. I'm sorry. Work ran longer than expected." "Were you with her?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. "With who, Emma?" "With Natalie," the little girl replied, pronouncing the name as if it were a forbidden word. Thomas felt as if he'd been doused with cold water. "Emma, we've talked about this. Natalie is just my boss and—" "No," Emma interrupted, tears forming in her eyes. "She wants to take Mom's place. I know it." "No, sweetheart. It's not like that," Thomas tried to explain, but Emma had already turned away, burying her face in her pillow. That night, Thomas could barely sleep. Emma's words echoed in his mind, mixing with guilt and confusion about his feelings towards Natalie. The following days were tense. Emma became more withdrawn, responding with monosyllables and avoiding spending time with her father. Thomas, for his part, immersed himself in work, trying to ignore the growing rift between him and his daughter. One afternoon, as he was reviewing some documents in his office, Natalie entered without knocking. "Thomas," she said, her voice laden with concern, "is everything okay? You've been distant these past few days." Thomas looked up, noticing the genuine worry in Natalie's eyes. For a moment, he considered telling her everything, sharing his fears and doubts, but something held him back. "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile, "just a bit tired." Natalie didn't seem convinced. She approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You know you can trust me, right?" Natalie's touch sent an electric current through Thomas. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to let go, to allow himself to feel something for someone other than Victoria. But then, the image of Emma, with her eyes full of tears and reproach, appeared in his mind. "I know," he said finally, gently pulling away. "Thank you, Natalie." That evening, determined to reconnect with his daughter, Thomas prepared Emma's favorite meal. As they ate, he tried to start a conversation. "How about we go to the amusement park this weekend?" he suggested hopefully. Emma looked up from her plate, a spark of interest in her eyes. "Just the two of us?" "Of course," Thomas assured. "Sounds like old times." For the first time in days, Emma smiled genuinely. "I'd like that, Dad." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Maybe, he thought, things would finally start to get better. However, as he cleared the plates, he couldn't help but notice the drawing Emma had left on the table. It depicted three figures: Thomas, Emma, and a woman with dark hair who could only be Victoria. Victoria's figure was surrounded by a golden halo, while in the background, barely visible, there was a dark shadow with blonde hair. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. The drawing was a clear reflection of his daughter's fears and anxieties. He realized that, although things seemed to be improving on the surface, there was still a long way to go. As he put the drawing away in a drawer, promising himself to talk to Emma about it another time, Thomas couldn't help but wonder how he would balance his own emotional needs with those of his daughter. And in the back of his mind, a question persisted. What role would Natalie really play in their lives? The weekend at the amusement park was like a breath of fresh air for Thomas and Emma. For a few hours, they were able to forget their worries and simply enjoy each other's company. Emma's laughter on the roller coaster, Her excitement at winning a stuffed animal at one of the games, and the way she clung to her father during the haunted house ride, all reminded Thomas of what truly mattered in his life. However, reality awaited them upon their return home. Monday morning, Thomas found himself back at the office, immersed in a new, high-profile project. Natalie was more present than ever, her energy and enthusiasm contagious. "Thomas," she said one day, entering his office with a radiant smile, "I have exciting news. We've been selected to present the campaign at the National Advertising Conference next month." Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "That's incredible, Natalie. But the conference is in Chicago, right? We'd be away for a whole week." Natalie's smile faltered for a moment. "I know it's a lot to ask, especially with Emma, but this is a unique opportunity, Thomas. It could be a big boost for your career." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, conflicted. "I don't know, Natalie. I need to think about it." "Of course," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "Take your time. But think about what this could mean for you, for both of you." That evening, while having dinner with Emma, Thomas decided to broach the subject. "Emma," he began, "there's something I want to talk to you about." Emma looked up from her plate, her big brown eyes fixed on her father. "At work, an important opportunity has come up," Thomas continued. "I would need to travel for a week next month. What do you think about staying with Grandma while I'm away?" The silence that followed was deafening. Emma slowly put down her fork, her expression turning somber. "Are you going with her?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. "Emma, we've talked about this. Natalie is just my boss, nothing more." "You're lying," Emma cried, standing up abruptly. "You're always with her. You don't love me anymore." Before Thomas could react, Emma had run to her room, slamming the door behind her. Thomas sat stunned, wondering how they had reached this point. How could his daughter think he didn't love her anymore? After giving Emma a few minutes to calm down, Thomas headed to her room. He knocked softly on the door. "Emma, can I come in?" There was no response, but the door wasn't locked. Thomas entered slowly. Emma was sitting on her bed, clutching a photo of Victoria. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "Sweetheart," Thomas said softly, sitting next to her, "I'm so sorry for making you feel this way. You are the most important thing in my life. You know that, right?" Emma sobbed, clinging tighter to the photo. "But you don't spend time with me anymore. You're always working or with her." Thomas felt his heart break. He wrapped Emma in his arms, kissing the top of her head. "I'm so sorry, Emma. You're right. I have been very busy lately. But I promise you that's going to change. You are my priority, always." "Do you promise?" Emma asked, looking at him with hopeful eyes. "I promise," Thomas assured. "In fact, what if we turned down this trip and instead planned a vacation just for you and me?" The smile that lit up Emma's face was all the answer Thomas needed. However, the next morning, when Thomas communicated his decision to Natalie, her reaction took him by surprise. "Are you sure that's the best thing to do, Thomas?" Natalie asked, her tone mixing concern and disappointment. "I understand that Emma is your priority, but you have to think about your future too, about the future for both of you." "I know," Thomas replied, feeling inexplicably guilty, "but Emma needs me now." Natalie moved closer, her perfume enveloping Thomas. "Thomas, you've worked so hard. You deserve this opportunity. Maybe we could find a solution that works for everyone." For a moment, Thomas allowed himself to imagine what it would be like. Success in his career, the admiration of his colleagues, the closeness with Natalie. But then the image of Emma alone and feeling abandoned appeared in his mind. "I'm sorry, Natalie," he said finally, taking a step back. "My decision is made." Natalie nodded slowly, a shadow of something indecipherable crossing her face. "I understand, but remember, Thomas, you can't put your life on hold forever. At some point, you'll have to think about yourself too." As Thomas left Natalie's office, he couldn't help but feel that something had changed between them. An invisible but palpable rift had formed. That night, as he watched Emma sleep peacefully, Thomas wondered if he had made the right decision. Was he really doing what was best for his daughter, or was he letting fear and guilt dictate his actions? And deep in his mind, a question persisted. What would Victoria have wanted him to do? The days following Thomas's decision not to attend the Chicago conference brought with them a mix of emotions. On one hand, his relationship with Emma seemed to be improving. The little girl's smiles were more frequent, and evenings were filled with conversations and laughter as they planned their upcoming vacation together. However, at the office, the atmosphere had subtly changed. Natalie, though still professional, maintained a distance that Thomas couldn't help but notice. Projects continued, but the long talks and moments of complicity seemed to be a thing of the past. One afternoon, as Thomas was working in his office, Natalie entered with an envelope in her hand. "Thomas," she said, her voice neutral, "this just arrived for you. It's from the Chicago conference." Thomas took the envelope, feeling a knot in his stomach. Upon opening it, he found a formal invitation to be one of the main speakers at the event. "This is amazing," he murmured, looking at the paper with a mixture of pride and regret. Natalie leaned against the desk, her eyes fixed on him. "It's a unique opportunity, Thomas. You could establish yourself as one of the leading voices in the industry." Thomas put the invitation down on the desk, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but Emma," Natalie finished for him, a hint of frustration in her voice. "Thomas, I understand that your daughter is your priority, but have you considered that maybe, in the long run, this could benefit her too? A successful and fulfilled father can offer more to his daughter." Natalie's words resonated in Thomas's mind. Was he really doing what was best for Emma by rejecting these opportunities, or was he letting fear and guilt dictate his decisions? I need to think about it," he said finally. Natalie nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "Of course, take your time. But remember, sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the good of those we love." That evening, while having dinner with Emma, Thomas couldn't help but observe his daughter with new eyes. She was chatting animatedly about her day at school, her eyes shining with a joy that had been absent for a long time. "Emma," Thomas said during a pause in the conversation, "are you happy?" Emma looked at him, surprised by the question. "Of course I am, Dad. Why do you ask?" Thomas smiled, but felt a pang of guilt. "I just want to make sure I'm doing what's best for you." "You're with me," Emma replied simply. "That's what's best." Emma's words warmed Thomas's heart, but also rekindled his internal conflict. Was he really doing what was best for Emma by limiting his own professional opportunities? The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and doubts for Thomas. On one hand, the idea of the Chicago conference and the opportunities it could bring excited him. On the other, the image of Emma feeling abandoned tormented him. One afternoon, as he was reviewing some documents at home, Thomas found himself looking at an old photo of Victoria. Her radiant smile seemed to challenge him, as if asking him what he was doing with his life. "What would you do?" "Victoria," he murmured, running a finger over the image of his late wife. As if the universe had heard his question, the phone rang at that moment. It was Emma's teacher. "Mr. Walker," said the voice on the other end of the line. "I was wondering if we could talk about Emma. There have been some incidents at school that concern me." Thomas's heart raced. "What kind of incidents?" "Well," the teacher continued, "Emma has been more withdrawn lately. And today she drew something quite disturbing during art class." Thomas felt as if the world had stopped. "What did she draw?" "It was an image of a family," the teacher explained cautiously. "But there was a dark figure in the background, like a threatening shadow. When I asked her about it, Emma refused to talk." After hanging up, Thomas stared at the phone, a whirlwind of emotions running through him. How had he not noticed that Emma was still struggling? Had he been so absorbed in his own dilemmas that he had missed the signs? At that moment, Emma entered the room, her backpack hanging from one shoulder. "Hi, Dad," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the weight his daughter was carrying. Without saying a word, he drew her into a tight hug. "I love you, Emma," he whispered, "more than anything in this world." Emma clung to him, and Thomas felt her tremble slightly. "I love you too, Dad." At that instant, Thomas made a decision. The conference, the professional opportunities, even Natalie, all of that could wait. What Emma needed now was her father. fully present and dedicated. "How about we start planning our vacation?" he suggested, pulling back slightly to look Emma in the eyes. The genuine smile that lit up his daughter's face was all the confirmation Thomas needed. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that he would have to find a balance between his responsibilities as a father and his professional aspirations. But at that moment, with Emma in his arms, he knew he was making the right decision. However, a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him that decisions have consequences and that the path he was choosing might have repercussions he couldn't yet foresee. Thomas's decision to prioritize Emma over his career brought momentary peace to their home. The following weeks were filled with moments of connection between father and daughter, board game nights, walks in the park on weekends, and long conversations about everything and nothing at all. However, at the office, things were far from calm. Thomas's absence from the Chicago conference didn't go unnoticed, and whispers from his colleagues followed him through the hallways. Natalie, for her part, maintained a professional but distant attitude, their interactions limited to what was strictly necessary for work. One morning, as Thomas was reviewing reports in his office, Natalie entered without announcement. "Thomas," she said, her voice tense, "we need to talk." He looked up, noticing the seriousness on her face. "What's going on, Natalie?" She closed the door behind her and sat across from him. "The board of directors is not happy with your decision not to attend the conference. They're questioning your commitment to the company." Thomas felt as if he'd been doused with cold water. "But the project went well. We met all our objectives." "I know," Natalie replied, her tone softening slightly. "And I've done my best to defend you. But they need to see more from you, Thomas. They need to know that you're willing to take that extra step." "My daughter needs me," Thomas said, frustration evident in his voice. "I can't just—" "No one's asking you to abandon your daughter," Natalie interrupted. "But you have to find a balance, for the sake of your career and for Emma's sake in the long run." Natalie's words stayed with Thomas for the rest of the day, weighing on him like a dark cloud. When he picked Emma up from school that afternoon, he struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy, but his mind was elsewhere. "Dad," Emma said during dinner, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. "Are you okay? You look sad." Thomas forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a bit tired from work." Emma looked at him with those eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Is it because of that lady, Natalie?" The question took Thomas by surprise. "Why do you ask that, Emma?" "Because whenever you mention her, you get sad," Emma replied with wisdom beyond her years. Thomas was speechless for a moment. Had he been that transparent? "No, sweetheart. Natalie is just my boss. Things at work are complicated sometimes." Emma nodded, but Thomas could see she wasn't completely convinced. "You know, the teacher told us today that sometimes adults have to make hard decisions for the good of their families." Emma's words resonated in Thomas's mind, mixing with Natalie's. Was he really doing what was best for his family by rejecting professional opportunities? That night, after putting Emma to bed, Thomas found himself looking at old photos of Victoria. In one of them, taken shortly before she fell ill, Victoria was smiling radiantly next to an award she had won at work. "What would you do, Victoria?" Thomas murmured, running a finger over the image. "How did you balance everything?" As if the universe wanted to answer him. The phone rang at that moment. It was Michael, his best friend and former colleague. "Thomas, buddy," said Michael, his voice mixed with the background noise of a bar. "How are you? It's been a while since we talked." Thomas sighed. "It's been complicated times, Michael." I know," his friend replied. "Hey, I heard about the Chicago conference. What happened?" For the next hour, Thomas confided in Michael, telling him about his dilemmas at work, his concerns about Emma, and his internal conflicts about Natalie. "Look, Tom," Michael finally said, "I understand you, really, but you have to think about the future. Emma needs a strong and fulfilled father. You can't put your life on hold forever." Michael's words, so similar to Natalie's, made Thomas question himself once again. Was he really doing the right thing? The next day, at the office, Thomas gathered his courage and went to talk to Natalie. "So I've been thinking about what you said," he began, closing the door to Natalie's office behind him, "about finding a balance." Natalie looked at him, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "And I want to try," Thomas said. "I want to prove my commitment to the company, but without neglecting Emma." A smile spread across Natalie's face. "I'm so happy to hear that, Thomas. Together, we'll find a way to make it work." As Natalie began to talk about upcoming projects and opportunities, Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that he would have to juggle his responsibilities like never before. But in the back of his mind, a small voice reminded him that every decision has consequences, and that the delicate balance he was trying to maintain could break at any moment. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Thomas. On one hand, he immersed himself fully in new projects at work, staying late at the office and taking on more responsibilities. Natalie was delighted with his renewed commitment, and the chemistry between them seemed to have reached its peak. On the other hand, Thomas struggled to keep his promise to Emma. He carefully scheduled his time to ensure he was present for dinners, to help her with her homework, and to spend weekends together. However, fatigue was beginning to take its toll, and he often found himself struggling to stay awake during movie nights with his daughter. One evening, as Thomas was working on his laptop in the living room, Emma approached quietly. "Dad," she said softly, "can we talk?" Thomas looked up, noticing the concern in his daughter's eyes. He immediately closed his laptop. "Of course, sweetheart. What's going on?" Emma sat next to him, nervously playing with the edge of her pajamas. "It's just lately you seem very tired, and sometimes when we're together, I feel like your mind is somewhere else." Emma's words were like a knife to Thomas's heart. Had his exhaustion been so obvious? "Oh, Emma," he said, drawing her into his arms. "I'm so sorry. I've been working a lot lately, but that's no excuse. You are the most important thing to me." Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with a maturity that sometimes scared Thomas. "I know, Dad, but I also know that your work is important. I don't want you to forget about yourself." Thomas was speechless for a moment. How could his little girl be so perceptive? "I promise I'll find a better balance," he said finally. "You and me against the world, remember?" Emma smiled, but Thomas noticed that it didn't quite reach her eyes. The next day, at the office, Thomas found himself distracted. Emma's words echoed in his mind, mixing with the demands of work and Natalie's constant presence. "Thomas," Natalie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Are you okay? You seem worried." He looked at her, noticing the genuine concern in her eyes. For a moment, he considered telling her everything, sharing his fears and doubts, but something held him back. "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about the next project." Natalie didn't seem entirely convinced, but she let it go. "Well, speaking of projects, I have exciting news. The board of directors is considering sending both of us to New York for an important presentation. It would only be for a week, but it could be a big step for your career." Thomas's heart raced. A week in New York. The opportunity was incredible, but a week away from Emma. I need to think about it," he said finally. Natalie nodded, but Thomas noticed a flash of disappointment in her eyes. "Of course. Take your time, but not too much. We need to give an answer soon." That evening, while having dinner with Emma, Thomas decided to broach the subject. "Emma," he began, "what would you think if I had to travel for work for a week?" Emma dropped her fork, the sound resonating in the sudden silence of the kitchen. "You're leaving?" "It's not certain yet," Thomas hastened to clarify. "I'm just considering the options." Emma looked down, playing with her food. "Is it because of her? Because of Natalie?" Thomas felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. "No, Emma, it's for work. Natalie is just my boss, I've told you that. But you're always talking about her," Emma murmured. "And now you want to leave." "Emma, look at me," Thomas said, gently taking his daughter's hand. "You are the most important thing in my life, always. If you don't want me to go, I won't go." Emma looked at him, her eyes full of unshed tears. "I want you to be happy, Dad, but I also want you here with me." Emma's words weighed on Thomas for the rest of the evening. As he tucked her in for bed, he noticed a drawing on her bedside table. It was an image of the two of them, smiling. But in the background there was a dark shadow with blonde hair. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Was this how Emma saw Natalie? As a threat to their family? That night, lying in his bed, Thomas found himself at a crossroads. On one hand, the opportunity in New York could catapult his career. On the other, the idea of leaving Emma, of potentially damaging their relationship even further, terrified him. As he stared at the ceiling, an idea began to form in his mind. Maybe there was a way to do both. To be the father Emma needed and the professional he aspired to be. With that idea spinning in his head, Thomas finally fell asleep, not knowing that the decisions he would make in the coming days would change the course of their lives forever. The next morning, Thomas woke up with renewed determination. He had spent much of the night thinking and believed he had found a solution that could satisfy both his professional responsibilities and his family commitments. During breakfast, he observed Emma carefully. The little girl ate in silence, occasionally glancing at her father. "Emma," Thomas began, "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about last night." Emma looked up, her gaze full of anticipation and fear. "How would you feel if you came with me to New York?" Emma's eyes widened. "Really?" Thomas nodded, a smile forming on his face. "Yes. It could be like a mini vacation for us. I would work during the day, but we'd have the evenings and the weekend to explore the city together." The idea had come to him in the middle of the night. If he could convince the company to let him bring Emma, he could fulfill his work obligations without sacrificing time with his daughter. "What about school?" Emma asked, though the excitement in her voice was evident. "I'll talk to your teacher. I'm sure we can arrange for you not to fall behind," Thomas replied. "What do you say? Would you like to come with me?" The smile that lit up Emma's face was all the answer Thomas needed. With renewed optimism, Thomas headed to the office, determined to present his proposal to Natalie and the management team. However, upon arrival, he was confronted with an unexpected scene. Natalie was in his office, surrounded by papers and with a worried expression on her face. "Thomas, it's good you're here," she said when she saw him. "We have a situation." For the next hour, Natalie explained that complications had arisen with the client in New York. The presentation had been moved up, and they now needed to leave in 2 days instead of next week. Thomas's heart sank. His carefully planned solution was crumbling before his eyes. "I know it's sudden," Natalie continued, "but this is a crucial opportunity for the company, and for you. I need to know if you can do it, Thomas." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his mind working at full speed. "Natalie, I just promised Emma I'd take her with me. I can't just..." Natalie's expression hardened slightly. "Thomas, I understand your situation, but this is important. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices for our careers." "My daughter is not a sacrifice," Thomas replied, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. A tense silence settled between them. Finally, Natalie spoke, her voice soft, but with a tone Thomas couldn't decipher. "Thomas, I've been patient. I've tried to understand your situation, but I need to know if you're really committed to this job, to us." The word us hung in the air, loaded with implications that Thomas had been avoiding confronting. "What do you mean by us?" he asked, though deep down he knew the answer. Natalie moved closer, her perfume enveloping Thomas. "You know what I mean. What's between us? It's more than just a professional relationship. You felt it too, haven't you?" Thomas took a step back, feeling as if the floor was moving beneath his feet. "Natalie, But before he could respond, the office door burst open. It was Emma, tears in her eyes and an expression of betrayal on her face. "Emma!" Thomas exclaimed, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "You forgot your lunch," said the little girl between sobs, holding a lunchbox. "Grandma brought me to give it to you, but..." Thomas watched in horror as his daughter's eyes moved between him and Natalie, understanding the scene she had just witnessed. "Emma, it's not what you think," Thomas began. But Emma had already run out of the office. Without thinking twice, Thomas rushed after her, leaving Natalie calling after him from the door. He found Emma in the building lobby, huddled in her grandmother's arms, Victoria's mother. "What's going on?" asked the older woman, confused by the scene. Thomas, panting, looked at his daughter, and then at his mother-in-law. At that moment, everything became clear to him. The decisions he had been postponing, the compromises he had been trying to maintain, everything converged in this instant. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice laden with emotion. "All of us." As he guided Emma and her grandmother out of the building, Thomas knew that the next few hours would be crucial. He would have to face uncomfortable truths, make difficult decisions, and above all, reconnect with what really mattered in his life. The shadow of Natalie, the weight of his career, and the future he had imagined for himself all seemed to fade in the face of the reality of his crying daughter and the memory of Victoria that his mother-in-law represented. The family cafe where Thomas used to take Victoria during their first dates seemed the appropriate place for the conversation they were about to have. Sitting at an isolated table, Thomas, Emma, and Margaret, Victoria's mother, formed a triangle of contained emotions and unspoken words. Emma, with red eyes, stared at her hot chocolate. Margaret, meanwhile, alternated her gaze between her granddaughter and her son-in-law, a mixture of concern and reproach in her eyes. "I think you owe us an explanation, Thomas," Margaret began, breaking the tense silence. Thomas took a deep breath. "You're right. I owe you more than an explanation. I owe you an apology and the truth." For the next hour, Thomas opened up as he hadn't in months. He talked about his pain over losing Victoria, about the pressure at work, about how Natalie had filled a void he didn't even know existed, but he also talked about his unconditional love for Emma, and how, at some point along the way, he had lost his bearings. "Emma," he said, turning to his daughter, "I'm so sorry. I've been so focused on trying to be a good father and a good professional that I forgot the most important thing, being truly present for you." Emma looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Don't you love Mom anymore?" The question hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. "Oh, sweetheart, of course I do. I'll always love your mom. Natalie was a mistake. I confused gratitude and friendship with something more. Something that can never replace what I had with your mother." Margaret, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. "Thomas, I understand you've been dealing with a lot, but Emma needs you. Victoria needs you, even if she's no longer with us." Her words, laden with emotion, made Thomas realize how much he had drifted away not only from Emma, but also from Victoria's memory. "You're right," he said, taking Emma's and Margaret's hands. "I've been so focused on moving forward that I forgot to honor the past and live in the present. That ends today." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to test his determination, Thomas's phone rang. It was Natalie. Without hesitation, Thomas rejected the call and turned off his phone. "What's going to happen now, Dad?" Emma asked, her voice small but hopeful. Thomas smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that he was making the right decision. "Now, sweetheart, we're going to start over, you and me as a team, and with Grandma Margaret helping us along the way." Margaret nodded, a smile forming on her lips. "I'll always be here for you." That's what Victoria would have wanted. The following days were a whirlwind of changes. Thomas submitted his resignation to the company, explaining that he needed time to reconnect with his family. Natalie tried to convince him to reconsider, but Thomas stood firm in his decision. "I'm sorry, Natalie," he told her during their last conversation, "but my family is my priority. It always should have been." With Margaret's support, Thomas began looking for new professional opportunities that would allow him a better balance between work and family. In the meantime, he devoted all his free time to Emma, rediscovering the joy of being a father. Together, they visited Victoria's favorite places in the city, cooked her favorite recipes, and most importantly, talked. They talked about the past, about their fears and hopes for the future. One afternoon, as they walked through the park where Thomas and Victoria used to take Emma when she was little, the girl stopped in front of a familiar tree. "This is where Mom and you carved your initials," Emma said, running her fingers over the marks in the bark. Thomas felt a lump in his throat. "That's right, sweetheart. Your mom used to say this tree was a witness to our love." Emma looked at him, an idea forming in her eyes. "Can we carve something too?" With tears in his eyes, Thomas nodded. Together, they carved a small heart next to Victoria and Thomas's initials. Inside the heart they inscribed, E plus T plus V, forever. Now Mum will always be with us, Emma said, hugging her father. Thomas held her close, feeling for the first time in a long time that they were on the right path. She always has been, sweetheart, and she always will be. As they walked away from the tree, Thomas looked up at the sky, a sense of peace enveloping him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges and difficult moments, but he also knew that with Emma by his side and Victoria's memory guiding them, they could face anything. The sun was setting on the horizon, bathing the park in golden hues. Thomas and Emma walked hand in hand, their shadows stretching behind them, and for a moment, if one looked carefully, it seemed that a third shadow accompanied them, silently watching over them.